last 5 years or so, I've headed the diplomatic team in Brussels. We have a team of about 15 colleagues in Scotland House on Rond-Point-Schumann. Please come and visit us. Our doors are always open. But more recently, also taken on the role of Director Culture and External Affairs. I'll be coming back to Edinburgh in the summer, and will be based here. I just want to make a few remarks and observations across 4 or 5 themes. I'm just going to start with the idea that Scotland is a European nation. This has come up a bit in the discussion, but I was reflecting on this yesterday. I mean, you can think about the old alliance with France going back to the 13th century, royal marriages over many generations, Denmark, France, Norway, religious connections that many of us will be familiar with from the arc of sort of religious history, trading relationships with Scandinavia, with the Low Countries, with Baltic states, the role of our ports. You know, we're not too far away from Leith here, and some of those connections over time. You think about our soldiers, our universities, our students, even in the modern era, our football clubs competing in Europe each season, at least until Christmas anyway. We tend to not get beyond that. Fundamentally, we see ourselves as European, and our history points to that, and maybe we feel that more strongly than kind of, you know, the UK average. We certainly, I think, feel that. In terms of Scotland and the European Union specifically, I think Scotland generally has been and continues to be, again, very positive about the European Union. You know, clearly this is not universal, but support for the EU, you know, was very clear in the referendum in 2016. There was a really strong majority in Scotland for remaining. If you look at other areas like Erasmus participation, the Scottish participation rate was noticeably higher than the UK average. And I think that sense of positive feeling about Europe kind of continues to be distinct for Scotland. It obviously varies across the political spectrum, but the discussion about Europe seems different and distinct in Scotland, and I think there's probably more consensus, whether that's around membership or whether it's about, if you like, having a close and cooperative relationship. There are areas that are more complex. I mean, fisheries is one where, you know, that there have been, you know, it's been more contested for various reasons. But I think if you look at it generally, support for Europe is and remains strong. I also wanted to mention Europe Day. Many of you in this room will be very familiar with Europe Day, but obviously the reason we're having this event is because it coincides with, and it's built around Europe Day. I mentioned the Scotland House office in the European Quarter in Brussels is on Rond-Point-Schumann, and many of you will be aware Robert Schuman, the French Foreign Minister, produced the Schuman Declaration, 9th of May 1950. It was the 5th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and it led to what became the coal and steel community, originally France, West Germany and Italy. It then grew into the European Union. And I think many of us at this time of year reflect on the founding principles and rationale for the Declaration and the beginning of those structures, which in simple terms was around seeking to ensure that war was materially impossible, the idea that we were better collectively in terms of our defence, our security, our prosperity, and bringing our people together. And those ideas always feel incredibly relevant to me when I think about Scotland's relationship with Europe, and sort of where it is today. So the Scottish Government has argued for as close as possible a relationship with the EU. At various points over the last 10 years, the Scottish Government has put forward positions and proposals around single market, customs union, free movement, has argued for as close as possible, and at one point a relationship more like, if you like, the one that Northern Ireland developed after the withdrawal agreement. Those ideas were reiterated again in our Scottish Government position paper in November of last year. And as officials, as the Scottish Government team, both in Brussels and in Edinburgh, our focus over recent years has been to push for progress wherever possible, to push for the closest relationship that we could have and to target areas where there were opportunities, where practically we felt we could move things forward that would deliver some of the economic benefits William was talking about, and some of the other people benefits, while noting and underlining that that could never replace the benefits of membership. And the Scottish Government position has continued to be that EU membership is really the best, and coming back into the EU is really the best sort of destination. Just a little bit on the post-Brexit period. So you'll recall the period, really, the couple of years after Brexit was characterised by a dispute on the Northern Ireland Protocol. That went on through sort of 2021 through to kind of early 2023. Progress in that period was incredibly challenging. The relationship between UK and EU authorities was at a very low ebb. Trust was at a low ebb. The signing of the Windsor Framework in February 2023 was usually what we look at as, you know, the sort of beginning of an upturn, and that was something the Scottish Government had pushed for and really supported. Since then, we've seen an improved tone. We've seen some positive steps forward, and the Scottish Government has really supported that, and actually done more than support it, push for it, advocate for it, publish papers around what could be done. I just wanted to touch on some of those things. So in late 23, an agreement was reached for the UK to come back into the Horizon Europe research programme, and that was incredibly important for Scotland. Brings our universities back into some of those partnerships and access to those funding streams. That was a kind of first, I would say, big step forward. Since then, we have pushed very hard. We've published, I think now, 8 policy papers. We're the only government in the UK that's published policy papers on the EU relationship and on what the UK government calls the reset. Have a look on the website, scotgov.brexit. You'll find all the material there. We argued for Erasmus reassociation. That deal has now been done. It will take effect in 2027. We will keep arguing for that to be continued into the next EU financial period from 2028 onwards. We published a big paper in August 2024 on a sanitary and phytosanitary SPS, or animal and plant health agreement. We've published papers on a youth mobility scheme, energy cooperation, emissions trading, and a number of other areas. And I just want to say a bit about the benefits of some of these things. I think on SPS, so animal and plant health, you know, this is not an abstract thing. Getting an agreement in that area will reduce barriers to trade, it will reduce paperwork and costs to businesses. It will allow specific Scottish products to get back onto EU markets. Things like seed potatoes, which are currently prohibited from going into the EU, or areas like sort of fresh, high-value seafood that simply cannot get through the checks quick enough, and that trade has been blocked off. So getting an SPS deal, I think, can bring some really important benefits. On energy, both electricity cooperation, where I think there is a big prize for Scotland, but also on emissions trading, which can remove some of the risks of being subject to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It can help us deliver our carbon objectives more quickly. I think these are things which can bring real benefits for Scotland. It will require dynamic alignment. I mentioned that we've had legislation in place for 5 years to facilitate dynamic alignment in Scotland, so I think we feel that we again have pushed that debate forward at the UK level. And if you talk to people like Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Cabinet Office Minister who leads for this in the UK government, he will say that the advocacy that we have shown on a number of these areas has helped, and indeed stakeholders in Scotland, whether it's universities or businesses, that is helping create more of a political space for the UK government to move forward, albeit it's kind of edging forward. So I think that kind of advocacy and providing evidence as to the benefits of what some of these things can offer, it does make a difference. Let me say a bit about what might happen next. I think that we had a leaders' summit in London in May of last year. So that was the Prime Minister with the leaders of the European Commission and the European Council. We think there will be another one of those coming. Probably, I would imagine, late June, early July. It's not absolutely confirmed. The aim of that event would be to conclude an agreement on things like SPS, emissions trading, a youth mobility scheme, but also to look ahead at what might come next. You know, what's the next wave of closer cooperation? What could that look like? And that's an area where we will, I think, under new leadership, I would imagine we will continue to be very vocal and seek progress. So what might be the kind of things that are on the horizon? I think cooperation on defence, we spoke about the failure of discussions on the SAFE EU instrument and UK association to that. Might that come back on the agenda? I think we would be very supportive of that. EU programmes, we've mentioned Erasmus. There's a bunch of other EU programmes that I think we would very much want to get back involved in. So what used to be called Creative Europe, for example, is now called Agora EU. That and others we will continue to argue for. There's a bunch of areas where there are talks going on between UK and EU, but it's moving incredibly slowly. Let me give you some examples. Doing more for touring artists, touring creative professionals who want to travel in the EU. We want to do more on that. Mutual recognition of professional qualifications, that allows people like architects and lawyers to practice more easily. Short-term business visitors to the EU. There's an article in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that allows further agreement on that that's not been used. And then if you think about energy and what Scotland has to offer from the North Sea, areas like renewable hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, these are areas where we want to see the EU and the UK intensify dialogue, and there are structures where that can be done under the specialised committees that exist under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So we've published thoughts on that. I think we'll continue to argue that more intensive focus needs to be brought onto those issues. We also think there are EU bodies, or indeed European bodies and agencies that we can participate in. One is the European Environment Agency. There's no reason why the UK can't participate in that and take an active role, and we'll be arguing for that. And then there's the question of UK citizens working in EU institutions. And EU citizens, you know, we've done a lot in the Scottish Government to ensure EU colleagues continue to be able to work with us. But can we do more to get Scots into EU institutions? You know, that's something I think we should look at. So what we've got is quite a kind of rich agenda there, but we do have some challenges that we've spoken on. Political uncertainty is a challenge, so we want to continue to move forward in a positive way. Just a few final thoughts. I think we've just had an election in Scotland. The outcome of the election is clear. The precise makeup of the Scottish Government we will find out over the next week or two, but I think it would be reasonable to assume that that pro-European, very kind of positive agenda will continue. We welcome the improved relationship between the EU and the UK. We want it to go further. We believe Scotland has a lot to offer in terms of some of the big European priorities. If you think about tackling climate change, if you think about some of the defence and security challenges, the need to innovate and find new ways of growing the economy. Scotland has a lot to offer into that agenda. And look, Europe Day reminds us why this is really, really important. And it's a great motivation, I think, to reflect on that and think about the future.
We'll kick off again with a panel discussion and then open it out to the audience. Is there anybody who'd like to start off?
So brilliant. There's one thing you touched on which just jumped to my mind, and it's that recognition both ways of diplomas. You know, brain power, knowledge is especially we're in a knowledge economy. We're still in an economy. Even if you're farming, you're using satellites and things you're using data, download data to make sure that you know which part of your crops is doing. So I don't think anything escapes from that. And anecdotally, but it's not the only example, I could probably find several. There's a young gentleman in the Vodafone shop on Princess Street. He's from Lithuania. He has a master's degree in energy transition, renewable. He can't work here. He can't use his diploma. It's not recognised. So he's doing a fantastic job managing the shop on, the Vodafone store on Princess Street. That is not how we should be using the talents, nor how we should be contributing our talents to what I would call the like-minded nations and creating that global stability, because it's only through that we will do that. But anyway, that is a huge point in terms of that interchange and recognition mutually of our diplomas. That's just one point.
Quite impressed by some of the stuff that the Scottish Government put out not long after Brexit. I remember it was just in terms of creative thinking. I think that on the one hand it threw up these questions about, well, if you're going to have to make it a choice, which is the bigger market economically between the UK and sort of the EU. But on the detail, I remember sort of the concept of parallel marketability being sort of explored of how you could sort of try and have this, I guess, sort of dual market access sort of maintained. And I thought it was really, really interesting to see the level of detail put in. I do think that the points, for example, on I don't think, for example, net zero is as contentious here, and so in the way that I'm glad that you mentioned something about the sort of the ETS alignment sort of piece also being in play, because very often you hear a lot of noise about the SPS agreement, but actually it's two agreements they're trying to get done, obviously, in time for the late summer or summer summit. And I think the point that you made about we could have. I think William also alluded to this, like the cost of renewable energy sort of could be potentially reduced. Is probably plays a little bit easier in Scotland than it does in other parts of the UK, where the whole question about renewables seems to be still being contention. And I think the fact that Scotland has a fairly fixed position on some of these starting points, on Europe, on sort of renewable energy, does make speaking about those benefits a little bit sort of easier. I think one of the things that I would like to see, you mentioned a whole raft of files there, is if Scotland has sort of an even greater sort of body of stakeholder relationships across academia, across industry, with sort of its European counterparts, I think what we probably really need to see, and William and I get told this very often on calls with government about sort of sort of trade with Europe and expanding, or even the scope of the reset, is we need to get more European businesses making these cases as well, European stakeholders making these cases as well. Being told that it's actively unhelpful to have just UK stakeholders making the arguments for this sort of the reset on the MRQP basis. I think that it would be helpful to try and see more of that being, if there's a greater body of relationships between Scottish stakeholders and their European counterparts, getting them to help make that argument. And I was very interested with the anecdote that you recounted about how actually some of the issues around sort of cost to access healthcare or the bills for it are actually stopping people from being able to access, come and do some of that R&D kind of work here. I think the more examples that the UK government as a whole and the Scottish government has can help sort of maybe push that narrative to just make it a real win-win, because I can assure you that the Commission is very good at also finding reasons not to progress on some of these sort of files. It's not just sort of the fact that the UK government might be slow in outlining what it wants. I think that there is a tendency sometimes in Brussels within the Commission to see this as if you win, we lose. And it really needs to be a kind of a win-win sort of framework. So I think that the more that can be done to try and leverage the relationships that Scotland has across a range of different areas with their European counterparts to help make that argument on a joint basis, the better.
Alyn makes a really important point, which is it's fine for us to be able to have better access to the European Commission than we've had 4 or 5 years ago. That's a great thing. But when you have our counterparts in Germany or Poland or Netherlands or France going and making those arguments for a stronger set of trading arrangements. That really does make a huge difference with the EU institutions. And watch out for the end of this month, because my understanding is that our counterparts at German Chamber of Commerce will be making a significant report on how they see the relationship developing. And that is, I think the timing is really, really useful, because that's the first time on this beat I've been in for about 9 years that I've seen an organisation as big as DIHK want to express a view on the future and how to deepen that trading relationship. And that will very much be aimed at the European Council and the European Commission and the European Parliament as well. So really, really important. Completely reiterate what was said on MRPQs. I think there is just in the air a little bit of a optimism around architecture. There was a prospective agreement on architect qualifications that got done in at the last minute, so we could be seeing that return. That would be the first positive benefit. But this is not just about legal services, it's also about financial services, it's about the whole range of services industries where we need to have these agreements in place, because otherwise it creates just an enormous barrier to doing trade. In terms of what the BCC hopes will come from the Leaders' Summit this year, we set out in our report in December 9 recommendations. Again, just to feed in some intel that we pick up, and David I'm sure will be speaking shortly, economic security issues very much to the fore. So we need to get deals this year on cars, otherwise we're going to have 10% tariffs on electric vehicle sales between the two markets from the end of the year. Disaster. The Made in Europe agenda, particularly the Industrial Accelerator Act, we're at the start of a kind of 15-month legislative process in Brussels on that. There's still some provisions in there for automotive, which are very challenging for our supply chains. So I get a strong sense that supply chain cooperation was not seen in 2020 when the TCA was negotiated as a priority. It now is. And I think there is quite intense activity on both sides to get something in there on that, and also something that frankly reflects the fact that Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish and English parts and components and companies are an intrinsic part of pan-European supply chains. That's a key principle, and we support having a binding agreement that in a sense provides a framework for future EU legislation to be looked at in the context of that notion. So I think we do have a big opportunity alongside potentially, I would say, pharmaceuticals, chemicals and automotive alignment being an area where the UK government could look to put forward a proposition this year. What we're really looking for is for the government to in a sense, convert the sort of impetus behind the May's lecture into a proposition that can be put in this Leaders' Summit and stand up to scrutiny and be negotiable in the next year or so from that. So we want to see, obviously, what's been agreed, progress done on that, but we've got to keep up the momentum. And there are key sectors where I think we're in a place where real propositions can be stood up and can be negotiated over the next period. That's where we think the energy has got to go. And just reflecting on some of the points earlier, I mean, there is going to be a very key issue here. One often hears some of these terms, forage-proofing, and we don't, of course, interact with those as a business organisation. But, of course, it is important when you speak to European businesses, when you speak to the EU institutions, that they do have the comfort and guaranteed that deals will not be unpicked without consequences in terms of the UK. So I think you will likely see quite strong linkages between the governance of these agreements that are reached this year and the governance of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And bear in mind, for non-performance of some of the obligations under the TCA, you can go to things like tariffs. So there will be an economic cost for the UK if it breaks or does not perform some of these agreements that will be made. And that could be a sort of powerful factor going into the next general election in terms of what some of the political parties would do after that. So, crucial period. We will keep up the momentum. I think there is a sense of growing momentum in Brussels behind this, and given where things were 10 years ago, it's no mean feat that we've got to that.
Well, in terms of the Brussels debate, I think it's important to recognise that Europe itself is going through a debate right now. The EU is going through a debate. What's the future of the EU? What's the future economically? What's the economic model now? Because obviously, you know, we now see very, very firmly the rise of China. A lot of European manufacturing is now struggling for competitiveness. I'm not closing me down on that. I think that Europe is still very competitive in many areas, but not necessarily the ones that we'd like to be competitive in, like electric vehicles for a start, and many other things. So there is that debate, and I do sometimes wonder if the UK, if Scotland can actually provide some suggestions on that. Be humble about it. I mean, we're not in, so we're not the ones who can tell the EU what to do. And sometimes you have that sense that people from Westminster are trying to tell the EU you're doing the wrong thing. That goes down so badly. But if you want to say, actually, look, let's talk about a future economic model. You know, how what Scotland does could play in. You know, how we could work with other like-minded economies. I think there is a space there to have that discussion. But of course, to be aware, and there's been a few mentions of the old alliance here. That not only did I not see much evidence of that in March, but it's a rugby reference. but equally, the French wouldn't necessarily have the same economic opinion as I think Scotland would potentially have, or indeed the whole of the UK. So if we're starting to talk about re-engagement with the EU, be aware there's a whole European debate going on all of this, and it's going to be a big debate, and I think it's going to dominate, quite aside from things like Ukraine as well, which we haven't really mentioned at all in the panel. You know, the EU has some big issues. The UK, Scotland can be helpful to those, or we can say, look over here, please pay us some attention, in which case they won't.
Actually, I came to believe in independence for Scotland while I was working in Brussels, doing my stage at Scotland Europa. Like many people in Scotland in the mid-90s, when I was at law school, I volunteered for the local Labour MP. My politics were always broadly centre-left, but not persuaded by independence. Independence in Europe got me over the line, because I think Scots are instinctively comfortable being part of something else. Now that, in its worst iteration, is the Scottish cringe, but we don't think the world revolves around us. We're comfortable sending people to London to represent us, we're comfortable sending people to Brussels to represent us. It was just another set of stuff being decided. And the UK has been tipped into, bluntly, chaos by the EU referendum, because so much of the balance of power in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, London even, in terms of devolution, all of it was predicated on everybody being in the single market and the customs union and the EU. So take that away, and the situation in Northern Ireland, where it's most delicate, was utterly scandalous, because Northern Ireland had so little consideration within the EU referendum debate. And Scotland likewise, we suddenly found that we had to choose. And a lot of people found that very uncomfortable, because just 18 months before the EU referendum, the independence referendum, a lot of people really did buy into the best of both. We're better together in Europe and UK, and Brexit threw that out. And I'm afraid the English local elections, just whatever it was in the last 24 hours, which is a bit of a blur for me, I have to say, but that points to the English debate going in a really dangerous place. And it's Professor Kieran Martin, who's a great thinker in this. He's at Oxford Uni, Blavatnik School of Government. He talks about an unthinking Anglo-centric British nationalism. All of those words are important. There's lots of people in UK politics who would not for a second think of themselves as nationalists, but Brexit threw that over. And all of these things are really delicate. So the SNP's position actually hasn't changed. In 2014 we wanted independence in Europe. 2016 we wanted independence in Europe. We still want independence in Europe. And I have to say as well, I can put my hand on my heart and say, I don't want to see England have a bad time either. And I think as neighbours and friends we have a duty to make sure that we do look after that. But the point about the EU's got its own business going on, I have seen British issues drop down the agenda in Brussels. And Scotland actually was ahead of the game in terms of getting into the room, because people like Martin have been doing this for decades, that we weren't a state but we were a presence. And then suddenly, when Uckra became Uckmiss, there was a lot of people suddenly found that they didn't have access anymore. So building that back has been really, really important. And that trust that was evaporated, willfully thrown away by people who are utterly historic in their attitudes and are now nowhere to be seen. It is staggering to me, we were talking earlier, it is staggering to me that the people who delivered Brexit are now pretending they got the answers to everything else. And the mainstream UK parties all adopted a programme that wasn't theirs and are now responsible for trying to make it work. And the great phrase that Elmar Brok, who was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Brussels, came out with a big bluff German, slapped the table and said, "Out means out!" And we are still guddling around trying to work out what out actually means, because there's lots of things that we want to get back into, but the EU's not going to do us any favours because it's busy living its life. And the MEPs are operating in a very, very different way. There was a huge turnover at the European election last. Lots of my go-to guys are now retired. And it's a different parliament and a different EU. And the EU that we want to go back to is not the EU that we left. There will be no rebate. There will be no Justice and Home Affairs opt-out. There will be no dodging the commitment to the euro. And from an SNP perspective, I'm comfortable with all of that. But I do not see the political maturity in UK politics to actually make those trade-offs, and I'm sad about that. And I'm also, as I said earlier, I think salami slicing us back into some sort of membership is democratically going to be vulnerable and could well be the flashpoint at the next UK election. So I'm not sure if I'm positive or negative about where the future's going, but from an SNP perspective, we know what we want. I also want to see the UK do well. And I think there is an opportunity in UK politics for somebody with a bit of vision and a bit of bravery to grab this. And if it's single market membership, if it's cussing and settle on something, I don't care. But at the moment we're settled on nothing. So it's all going to be cuddling around the edges with symptoms rather than a vision.
When these negotiations are going on between the UK government and Europeans, is there anyone from the Scottish government in the room? And if not, why not?
The short answer is no, there isn't in those negotiations, the ones that are ongoing. But the Scottish Government is very close to the negotiations. And what I mean by that is we're having regular discussions with the negotiating teams. We are both, as it were, publishing positions, but then having sort of live discussions about where negotiations are going. And at ministerial level as well, there has been a level of dialogue that's probably been a bit better than it might have been if you rewind a few years. So I think, no, we're not in the room. I mean, there are a limited number of seats at the table. I think there are occasions when we argue that maybe we should be. But I think we do have a good dialogue and a reasonable level of dialogue with the relevant teams. That doesn't mean they have to make choices, and sometimes, you know, that means that the priorities we put forward may not be the top ones. But I think, to be fair, we're having that dialogue. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement has a series of specialised committees that meet once or twice a year. Scottish Government officials do sit at some of those tables, areas like law enforcement and judicial cooperation, where we have our own responsibilities. So again, we're continuing to push this at all levels and trying to make sure our voice is heard. That's our absolute priority.
I was very interested in what you said, William, about if agreements are made with the EU and then undone, how costly that would be or could be. And I align that with my worries about the directions in which UK politics is going. And if we have even more support for reform, then I could see that scenario arising. And so, as I said to Alyn in the break, what I think is very important is simple communication. Simple communication about the sort of issue that you touched on, so that people in the general public get that idea straightforwardly. And I can imagine, come the general election if Nigel Farage is really a possibility for number 10, that there will be anything other than truthful, straight communication. So I would ask everyone who's involved in any way in communicating with the public that straight, simple communication is kept in mind and not sophisticated intellectual arguments that tend to go over most people's heads.
Every Brexiteer that we met had a false view. I mean, absolutely, thought that we had no power, thought we were, the playbook of the Brexiteers, basically. And I think, to your point, that's exactly what we want. And that playbook will still be there, and we can open it. And that's why, to your point, we mustn't be on the back foot batting back. We've got to find some strong messaging and simple messaging for that. So yeah, I think that's I think when you, for example, that example that I gave of the amount of power that was lost, and these are people we were with folks here in Scotland who said, we're staunch Brexiteers, and we still are. And when that discussion about how much power we had thrown away, and therefore why in the current geopolitical situation we are scrambling to build that trust back with partners, with like-minded middle power nations. And by the way, we're not doing too badly, because Germany, we've got the Trinity House and the Lancaster House, and with France we've got the coalition of the willing going on. But these are just a starting point. But I do think the public and getting that message across.
But when we talk about communication, I mean, I'm specifically fixating on the kind of linking and trying to, whatever you want to call it, Farage-proof, reform-proof some of the agreements. I distinctly recall when we were trying to have a discussion about what the sort of counterfactuals were to having an agreement in place, not just to leave the EU, but to have a new relationship, that there were a lot of people on the pro-Brexit side who were pretty much like, bring it on, no deal, fine with it. And I think it was to some extent the interventions of the business community at that point that really did, I at that time was in the business community, and we got a lot of flack from it, from a lot of, including the government at the time, for weighing in on the issues of no deal. I raise that only to say that keep in mind that even if you are straight with the public about saying you may lose a trade and cooperation deal, I could very much see Reform saying, so what? So just be careful what you wish for when it comes to straight communication. I think it needs both this sort of, and that might be the point at which the business community would really raise its head above the parapet. I think that, again, I come back to this point to say, yes, I think more businesses are sort of in favour of alignment. I don't know how vocal they are invested in being at a huge basis on this point on the reset. I think they will come out when they need to, but I just think that there's a lot of businesses who were sort of got burned by getting involved in the debate last time. I think they might come out if they think that the whole house of cards is going to come down in terms of our overarching framework with the EU. I hope that they come out, but I think that a lot of people got their fingers burned and are worrying about, they want the stability most of all. They don't want the chopping and the changing constantly.
In response to that, what was raised just now, could you then please try and think about how could Scotland lead in then convincing someone to rejoin, or, okay, it's not a concise question. When Britain first applied to join the European communities, Scotland was actually opposed. Now I see Scotland being very much in support of Europe. How do you think Scotland can lead in bringing the UK back into Europe then? What do you think the UK overall can then learn from Scotland, where the opinion about Europe has changed apparently over the last 60 years?
Let me say two things. Okay, firstly, I spoke about technical policy ideas that we've put on the table. That is very important in an EU context. Okay, it's a legal entity, it's very technical, it thinks about policy. Continuing to have really precise ideas about what we can do next together. But the second point is much more kind of bigger picture and inspiring. I think a combination of Erasmus participation plus the prospect of a youth mobility or youth experience scheme, that begins to create a really positive sort of backdrop about people-to-people links, particularly young people. And I think the more we can build that narrative, that can begin to inspire people about this in a way that some of the technical stuff probably can. So I think it's those two things together for me.
I want to thank everybody who's participated in the panel and who's spoken today.